welcome again to all of you. I really do hope that you enjoy the exciting journey that you've commenced tonight. What I'm aiming to do is to talk for a maximum of 45 minutes and leave time for some discussion and questions after my talk. But where I want to begin is to invite you to consider yourself first as a biological system, refined through evolution in all kinds of sophisticated ways. Subject still to the same drives as most life forms, and still seeking to maintain homeostasis, to optimize our functioning. And at the same time as we're influencing others, we're also being influenced by others. So bring your awareness to your bodily state and notice how you're sitting, whether and where in your body you're feeling tense. Perhaps seeking to avoid pressing against your neighbour or managing the discomfort of the plastic chairs. Notice your temperature, your bodily temperature, and whether and where you're perspiring, and how self-conscious you are about your own odours and that of others. And think about your breathing, and whether your chest is allowing you to breathe deeply, or is it tense and constricted and only allowing shallow breaths. And then what I want you to do is to bring your attention to your brain, the bodily organ sitting above this, controlling it. Think about how it's both regulating your body and enabling your observing of yourself. And then thinking about the physical brain and the connectedness of the neurons, we can use a metaphor of the most complex of city street systems and think of the traffic on that roadway. And think of that as what we call mind, moving along those pathways. Our thoughts and images, our bodily sensations associated with them, construct a world inside our heads, or perhaps we might think of it as a map of our world, a sat-nav system if you like. And in your small groups, you're going to be discovering how your own personal map is both unique in many ways, but also universal in many other ways. How it's developed and how it organizes your perceptions and management of your world. So our physical state, our state of bodily excitation or understimulation, will be reflected in our mental state by alertness or boredom or sleepiness, and vice versa. A thought we have may jerk us awake and set our body and mind racing. So again, just think now about your own mind, and whether your mind is open, focused, or anxious, or wandering. And what I want to think about is our social self and the ways in which, within that mind, we've developed a way of presenting ourselves, of being shaped by the world that we've been born into and that we've also created for ourselves. So can I ask you next to notice and recall how your mental state has altered as you approached Daleham Gardens and came into the Institute this afternoon and during the day. Whether your starting here affected your sleep, your dreams, how you selected what to wear, and whether you chose to wear makeup, what kind of makeup, or not, to put on. And to think consciously or unconsciously, you were making decisions about how to present yourself to us at the IGA, but also to your fellow students. And how in starting here this evening, you may have memories or associations to other beginnings in other groups. Your first day in a job, or at university, at school. Maybe for some it takes us right back to nursery. And then consider which of those things you feel comfortable about sharing with your neighbour, and which you might feel uncomfortable sharing with the whole group. I'm not going to ask you to do either. So I hope this exercise might help make real that fundamental precept of group analysis, that we're first and foremost social beings, and how counterintuitive that is within our culture, where we think of ourselves as individuals first who join groups, rather than understanding that we're born into groups, we're constantly in groups, whether or not we're in the presence of others or not, that groups are influencing how we think, how we behave, who we are. That these influences won't always be obvious to us. The meaning of them, the roots of them, will lie in our culture, in the history of that culture, but also how it becomes transmitted through the family or through individuals within our family. That will be influencing some of our choices, how we feel about things, and how we're influenced by the norms of society. Some we shall be conscious of, and some we'll be blind to until we step outside of our society, our own culture, and we enter another culture or society with other kinds of norms, and we become aware of the things that we've taken for granted and how other people have quite different automatic assumptions and rules for life. Group analysis, when we talk about it, can be confusing. So we mean both group analysis as a body of knowledge about groups and about individuals as member of groups. But it's also, when we use it, the term group analysis, we're often referring to it as a form of psychotherapy, both in a classical form which you'll be experiencing in your experiential groups, a version of, and applied in the ways that it will need adapting in many of the clinical settings that we work in, and as we're dealing with particular groupings of people who've been shaped by sets of experiences, whose minds may be subject to influences or disorders which need to be properly adapted to by the groups that we run. It's a very broad church in terms of its theory. What we'll find, and you'll learn over the 2 terms of lectures, that it includes important ideas from psychoanalysis, from sociology, from general systems theory, Gestalt theory, attachment theory, complexity theory, and it will continue to multiply as we think about how we apply some of these theories within groups and within group situations. It gives group analysis both a beauty and creativity, as well as a problem in terms of its inclusiveness. That for any of us who are trained as group analysts, we can often be thinking, are we a real group analyst? Because we have some notion of what a real group analyst might do or think, and a sort of idealized notion of what a traditional group analyst might be doing. In reality, we all are group analysts, and we're all finding our own adaptation of these ideas and working with groups of people together. In terms of the method of psychotherapy, we're generally talking a once weekly or twice weekly group, which traditionally will always meet for an hour and a half. There are different models of that group therapy. Quite often we will be talking about a slow open model, whereby when a vacancy occurs, we'll be introducing another person into that group. And what we're doing there is developing a culture that we're bringing others into. But there will also be closed groups that we may run for a shorter period of time. And again, we've needed to think about how we apply group analytic concepts within that kind of group and for specialized purposes. So before proceeding further, I want to go back to some more biology to make sense of some of those instinctual drives that I was talking about. Because it's helpful to think about what's fundamentally going on in terms of some of the activity that are involved in our behaviors with one another, and how, from evolution with the simplest and most primitive of life forms, we've needed to survive in order to thrive. That natural selections on the ability to reproduce and to adapt. And that as a species, with a sum of our biological evolutionary heritage. And what we find in evolution, that many species have developed groups as a means of survival in order that also that they can thrive. So to think about how many different life forms we may see as we watch our nature programs who choose to operate mainly in groupings. That in order to function in that way, that we've needed some instincts and sophisticated ways of communicating that enable those groupings to work together. Perhaps when you come to the large group in the summer term, let alone the large group that was being described for the gassy conferences, you may end up feeling like a fish within one of those shoals, and the same loss of mind that may occur to you. It's important for us to have that experience, to understand what can happen in a crowd and how it is we can feel a loss of some of our moral compass within those sorts of situations. But if we go back 100 million years on our evolutionary tree, which is the beginnings of the mammalian branch of that tree of life, we can think about how more sophisticated brains required more time to develop. And this was only possible with the mammalian form of reproduction. And that in order for that to occur, required biologically based social instincts of care-seeking and care-giving. And to understand that within our heritage, we were once those rat-like creatures. So if we go from 100 million years ago to 300 million years ago, to think about how also within our brain we retain our older, more primitive reptilian heritage in our midbrain. And to think about our fear system with its fight, flight, freeze response. And how, although we have the more sophisticated neo-mammalian cortex that's built upon those foundations, that still will be influenced by some of those very primitive responses. And that if we have an understanding of that and how our state of arousal or our availability for exploratory behaviour when our fear system is quiescent is going to depend on our sense of security, our sense of safety. And as you enter your small groups tonight, or as you enter the room this evening, to be aware of how able you were to think or not to be able to think, and how anxiety can sometimes flood us. So if we begin just thinking a bit about Foulkes, who is the founder of group analysis, who made that statement that we're first and foremost social beings. And it's helpful to think a little about his life and the social and cultural forces that shaped his ideas and have continued to influence the path of group analysis. He was born as Siegfried Heinrich Foulkes. He was born into a German Jewish family, and he studied medicine, graduating in 1923. The most important influence in his life was studying in the Frankfurt Institute within a department run by Kurt Goldstein, who was the founder of general systems theory, whose studies of the brain were very influential for a whole raft of people working at that institute. The discoveries of Kurt Goldstein was how the whole brain needed to be thought of as a primary unit, how a damaged part of the brain could be replaced by another part, and to be understanding how in a groups those sorts of understandings can be helpful in seeing how when we locate difficulties or assets in one individual, we may not be recognizing how possible it might be for the group to be taking up those functions with other individuals. He went on to train as a psychoanalyst between 1928 and 30, and then became director of psychoanalysis at the Frankfurt Institute. And then, despite or because of the trauma of Nazism, what's very interesting that although he had to come to England in 1933, he was assisted by Ernest Jones in order to do so, he talks very little about the destructive potential of groups. It's taken others at later stages in development of group analysis to think about the destructive forces. And Morris Nitzan is a name that you'll come across, who will develop the idea of anti-group that again people have picked up and thought about and thinking about, is this something which we need to understand? But along with that, the idea that actually coming into group is the last place most people seeking therapy would want to be. It's a place that's most feared, but particularly for that reason it may be the most helpful place. And it's that kind of paradox that we're often working with as a group analyst. We don't expect people to want to be in a group. When he came to England, he started up in private practice and individual psychoanalysis in Exeter. And what he found was that the demand for his services were too great for him to supply the need. So he began to see people who were waiting for psychoanalysis. And what he found was that seeing individuals in a group was as powerful and as effective as it was for him to be meeting with them individually. And he began to develop ideas about this. And again, important to understand how group analysis has grown out of a method rather than a method coming out of a theory. When the war came, there was a problem of those soldiers who were traumatized, who were being treated for various disorders at Northfield Hospital. There'd been a first experiment, as it was called, by Wilfred Bion, who'd sought to set up a therapeutic situation, community in his hospital, which didn't work, which collapsed. It was seen to be too antithetical to the military in terms of the ideas that he was promulgating. Foulkes had a different kind of understanding and worked with the system and found that there were ways in which soldiers could be helped to regain their minds, their sense of self. It was at a point, though, also where soldiers were being discharged, so it wasn't just about putting them back into the battlefield. But again, there were some important lessons about working with teams and subgroups and the role of work within that ethos. And some of those experiences have led on into the therapeutic community movement within Britain. Foulkes himself went on to work at the Maudsley Hospital and St Bart's, and it's been one of the main ways in which psychotherapy has been offered to patients at those hospitals through being in group analytic groups. What you've heard about is the Group Analytic Society, which was formed in 1952 out of those who were interested and wanting to learn more about the ideas of Foulkes and others who were around him. And that led to the Institute being founded in 1971. That's 43 years ago now. And it's led on into trainings across Europe since then. One of those early founders was Robin Skinner, who founded the Institute of Family Therapy, and again there was that interest in the artificially constructed groups that we might put together for therapy and a natural group of the family. It's been a whole other strand of development. So what I want to do now is just to talk about some of the key concepts in group analysis. And this quotation is taken from Norbert Elias, who was a sociologist who trained also at the Frankfurt Institute, who wrote a very influential text, and it went out of favour, and then it's come back into fashion again as people have begun to understand the depth of his insights. What he did was to study courtly behaviours and how they became transmuted into social norms throughout different societies, the ways in which power was very much at the heart of all relationships. His study might sound bizarre, but it was included bodily habits, about nose picking, about defecation, about sex, what was considered polite or normal, and ways again in which things developed within courts were aped, were copied, and taken to be the new norm by those who wish or aspired for a higher status, and how they became, if you like, part of the social unconscious, and what was subject of social acceptability or of shame. The matrix, which Frances said that she'll be lecturing about in a couple of weeks' time, is one of the most complex of concepts, but it's an important and unique contribution that group analysis has made in thinking about groups. To be thinking about the network of communication that has both a historical element and a current element to it. That unless we can think about the matrix, we may not be able to make sense of the meaning of behaviour or a communication, a verbal communication or other kind of communication. What we'll discover is that when we pay attention to the matrix, we'll find there are certain things which are shaping it. That a conversation may apparently be about one thing, and yet if we look underneath it, we understand that it's being influenced by a break, by an absence of a group member, by a joining of a new member or leaving of an old member. And there may be within that matrix all kinds of feelings that may be, and words that may be previously uttered that don't need to be spoken again because something has been digested and processed by that group that's being transmitted in ways which convey an understanding and acceptance which may not need spelling out again. I want to give an example from a group I ran last night where I had a new group member join. What was interesting was the group was performing beautifully. It was insightful, it was interactive, it was challenging. I realised I was feeling quite proud of the group and the way it was performing, almost a little smug. And then I realised that actually what was happening was very effectively they were showing off, at the same time they were being quite excluding of the new member. There was absolutely no way this new member really could find a way in, that they were doing all of the work and doing it in such a way that they were helping this new person to feel really quite small, quite helpless, and making it plain that they didn't need that new member. They were doing something to me too. They were making me overlook what was going on. They were making me feel like the proud father who was going to pat them on the head. They perhaps also were vying for my attention. They were very reluctant to accept any interpretation that perhaps there was something else going on, that really they didn't want this new group member, that they felt quite hateful towards this person because all of their outward behaviour was about welcoming, being polite, not wanting to put the new one on the spot, and therefore actually leaving them out altogether. And it's those sorts of things which as a group analyst one needs to be alert to, both what's going on in the group but also in oneself, because one is always part of that group. In the training you'll be receiving over this year, hopefully you'll develop that ability to both be in the group as well as outside the group, being able to be an active participant as well as developing an observing ego who's noticing what's going on in you as well as in others and in the group. The other way in which we need to think about that matrix is to be understanding that an individual may be communicating something, but they may be simply communicating something on behalf of the group. And to be thinking about why that individual might be communicating about it, and that's maybe something more general, more universal, which is being spoken. And the idea that that might shift, but there's something that's occurred for them to be speaking, perhaps, or sharing at that moment. What we learn is that individuals, through their own upbringings, their place in their sibling group, their family group, develop a valency for certain roles, for certain types of feelings. They have an attraction or susceptibility for certain emotions. And how quickly a group will pick up on those valencies, and they will almost find a way in which that person, individual, may occupy that space for that group, and how difficult it may be for that individual to escape from it, and may find themselves repeating that role again and again in different groupings they come into. One of the things that we aim to do within group analysis is to ensure that we are always challenging what gets fixed, what gets set, to stir it up a bit. The value of bringing new members is to perhaps to lay bare what may seem to have become part of the culture, what may have become too set, and to ensure that we have the opportunities for people to occupy different roles, that the newest member at some time in the future will become the oldest member of that group, the most experienced one, that they have a full range of roles to explore and become interested in. What we learn also is that when individuals come to a group with problems that they want help with, is that what we're discovering is that often that they're representing, or their difficulties are symptoms of the groups that they are members of outside of the therapy group. Often it's going to be their own family groupings. And it's a disturbance in that network which has led them to have the difficulties that they have. The significance of it is that we primarily work through words within groups. It is the most communicative form of interaction that we have, and to make sense of something, to communicate about it, is something we do with words. What we find, though, often is that it will be behaviours and how something is spoken of that's going to be the telltale. So it's not just the what, but the how. From Gestalt, we take the notion of the figure and ground, that it's impossible to think about both the individual and the group simultaneously. And so what we begin to do is to develop the ability to move in and out, a bit like a camera and a zoom lens. You can sometimes to take the wide angle lens to think about what's going on in the group or outside of the group, around the group. To be aware, for instance, at the moment with Ebola in the news, that we in some ways are being subtly influenced by some of the fears of what it might mean to be in large groups of others, and how would we know who's infected, who isn't. Perhaps it's something that may come to more prominence as we travel, but it may also be there with people who've said that they've recently arrived. To be aware that that begins to influence perhaps any small group we're part of. And that as we discover in a group that all of us come from slightly different cultures, we may look outwardly similar, and yet those differences will become apparent as we get to know people in more depth. And the paradox is that actually we become an individual in the presence of others as we become known by others. The fear as we enter a group is often that we lose our individuality. Another way of thinking about it is we begin life in a group as a singleton, as a one-off. As we become known in a group, we become a true individual whose multifaceted nature, personality, becomes recognised. That when we say something, it's understood for what it is, in a way that it often may be misunderstood by others. And that we begin to reclaim parts of ourselves in a group that we might not have been able to reclaim in other kinds of therapeutic situations. Typically, we'll find them in others, and the last parts we'll often claim back for ourselves are those that we don't want to recognise, that perhaps we attribute to others who we rather despise or hate within that group situation. There'll be something about them that we don't like, that we don't want to know. It'll take someone else in the group to point out that actually, you know what, that person in some ways is rather like you in the way that you talk or the way you behave or the problems you're describing. And bit by bit, as we begin to make a relationship to that other, we see them perhaps in a way we hadn't recognised initially. We begin to make friends with that part of ourselves that previously we've disowned and we've projected off into the other. So when we talk about group analysis And think about the notion of free association in psychoanalysis, and in a group we talk about a free-floating discussion. And again, this is the ideal. You're probably going to be closer to it in your experiential groups than you will in any other groups that you seek to run or that you might be part of. What you'll learn also is that the role of the conductor is not so much about what he or she does, but as to what they won't do, and how a group and individuals benefit and gain insight through being frustrated in their desire to be led. And so we use that term conductor, which Foulkes first used, as a way of trying to suggest that, with an orchestra, the conductor is not there to tell the orchestral players how to play, but they're there to bring a shape, perhaps to bring out certain sounds that might not otherwise be heard, to think about the music overall. But to notice how the really skillful conductor, the one who's known to have wisdom, will probably bring out the best in those orchestral players. And how, if there isn't that kind of rigour brought to what may appear to be just simply waving a baton, that actually there may be a bit of a free-for-all and more chaos without understanding. The main task of the conductor is to select members, to demonstrate and model certain behaviours for the group, to be reliable and punctual in starting and ending the group on time, and to monitor him or herself for what feelings, what images perhaps are being arising in themselves, and contributing from time to time by translating communications that others are perhaps failing to understand as to what may be occurring. Interpretation, in the way that we might talk about it in psychoanalysis, is, if you like, the last resort that might be deployed when it feels as if the communications got blocked and simply the group is unable to progress. But in general, what we'll find in group analysis is responsibility is with the group, and there's a trust that actually the group will become more mature, more capable, if they're left to find the solution to their own difficulties within the group. What we seek to encourage, the idea of the free-floating discussion, are the conditions of free speech, and to understand how often any of us might begin with describing ourselves or describing our problem, not knowing yet how to have a duologue with another, not in such a way that the other really truly understands us, let alone a dialogue with multiple others, where we can tolerate the fragmentary nature of it and have confidence that perhaps by listening I will learn as much about myself as I will as if I talk and look out for advice. What importantly we'll come to learn is that through that dialogue, what we are looking for is a greater freedom of thought. That we'll understand that in the group, we'll begin to internalise the contributions of the different group members. That as we're away from the group, from those times when we're meeting face to face, we'll still have individuals coming into our mind, the things that they might say, how they might see a situation, how they might describe the situation that we're presented with. And we find that our own thinking has been influenced. And one might think of it as a corrective to the family situation and perhaps the ways in which we've thought about ourselves or about other situations which haven't been subjected to that same critical gaze. What we're doing in a group is developing every member as a group analyst. That your learning is both about yourself but about others and about the group as a whole. Our task as a group conductor, in a sense, is to make ourselves redundant. It's not to be showing off our expertise or insight. what we know is, and confident of in every group that I certainly go into, is that actually another individual will understand different facets of other individuals, members of that group, much better than I will. They will be much more effective in helping that person feel understood, that perhaps in the group are others whose experiences have been very close to perhaps what the person who's speaking or sharing at that point will be communicating about. As we think about the group, we can think about levels of the group functioning. The current level might be thought of as the more surface level, important nevertheless in terms of the advice giving, the ways in which we might talk in an intimate social conversation, but where there's an honesty, a desire to reflect back accurately what it is we're experiencing of another person. But alongside that, there's a transferential level, where perhaps we're finding our brother, our sister, our mother, our father, our son or daughter in the group. And we're aware of that influencing how we're acting, how we're feeling in response to that person, or how they're reacting to us. And then we're finding ourselves being responded to in a way that surprises us. Another level would be the projective level, which I was describing earlier, where we might not be aware of what we're disowning of ourselves and projecting it into another, and how another individual in the group may perhaps be identifying with that projection, that part of ourselves that we dislike, and acting it out for us because of their own particular valency. We might find in a group someone who is describing themselves as being a victim in every circumstance, that they can't trust others, that they're always made use of by others, that their own needs are never getting met, that they're likely to attract very quickly some of the feelings of despising and of rejection by others, that they'll be accepting a very low status within the group and be seen to have little to offer. It's going to be important in that group to explore actually what is it that's happening, that we're seeing the problem as being this person rather than perhaps belonging to us all in terms of the parts of ourselves that we dismiss and that we project off. And that at the primordial level might be related in some way to Jung's collective unconscious, some of the more primitive emotions that might go back to some of that biological heritage I was talking about, but also perhaps there within our cultural history, and how perhaps in a children's group and adolescent group we may see something brought alive in some of those murderous fantasies being enacted and talk in a way which as adults we've learnt to cover over with our civilized discussions. But it's there underneath. In a large group, hopefully, some of that also will emerge in a safe way. So the other understanding is the ways in which the size of the group, the numbers of members of a group, are going to be influenced in dynamics, and what, if you like, comes to the foreground. With a small group, we've got an intimate space that's typically going to be more about if you like, the family situation. It's not official abstraction, but it's those sorts of issues, dilemmas, which are more likely to come to the foreground. With a medium group, you might think about a village or a tribe, and in terms of those cultural factors which typically might arise. With a large group, again, there may be more social issues which come to the fore, and some of the dilemmas that come along with that. But also the loss of the individual mind as we feel taken over and our own fear system becomes very aroused. What we aim to do in the security of our boundaries, to be putting out our chairs at the beginning of a group to start and to finish on time, is that we do convey that this is a safe space for exploration. We may say that, and yet we know it remains a very fearful space for some time, that the trust has to be earned, that we have to discover as we give unwitting, unintended offence to another, as that get resolved, as people turn up week by week, that actually finally we do learn that perhaps anger can be constructive, it doesn't have to be destructive, that to upset another may not be our responsibility, but we need to be available to help another understand what it was that they took to mean quite differently from how we intended, in a way that we can learn and become more effective at communicating, more effective in making our needs known. What we hope is, finally, is that the group becomes a place where we can bring all kinds of messy, complicated, painful, joyous feelings, that all of those do belong in the group. And we might feel that we can be met as a person in a way that might be quite unique. And that typically in a clinical setting, and think about groups that I've run with men with avoidant antisocial personality disorder, the ways in which perhaps you can create a space in which they describe themselves as the one place where they can take off the mask and where they can feel that they are truly understood because they're with individuals who have been through some of those shared experiences, who manage the world, who manage themselves in a similar way that feels so threatening and so destructive to others and fails to recognise actually the very vulnerable, abused, small children that exist within those heavily plated armour and weaponed fronts. And that's where I'm going to stop. And before I invite any thoughts or reflections, I'm going to suggest that you just have a conversation with your neighbour for 3 or 4 minutes, just in terms of your immediate responses to what you've heard. What is it that stands out for you? What are your puzzlements about any of the things I've said? And then I'll be asking for questions after that. So just take 3 or 4 minutes in pairs or threes.